The name Peter Stumpp is synonymous with one of the most horrifying and mysterious tales of the 16th century. His story, deeply intertwined with themes of witchcraft, diabolism, and werewolf lore, reflects the anxieties and superstitions of a society which saw the devil's hand in many unexplained phenomena. The legend of Peter Stumpp, the so-called Werewolf of Bedburg, is a grim narrative of murder, madness, and the dark depths of human fear. To fully understand the terror that Peter Stumpp inspired, one needs to understand the historic and social setting of the time. Bedburg in modern Germany was a small countryside town within the electorate of Cologne during the late 16th century. Its economy was firmly set upon agriculture, steeped in the infamy of deep religious beliefs. The period was characterized by religious turmoil, with the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation causing the schism of Europe. This was also a period of witch hunts on a pan-European scale, driven by the fear of the devil and of his earthly agents. Superstition was rife, and any event that could not otherwise be explained was attributed to supernatural intervention. In such an atmosphere, the possibility that a man might be able to take on the form of a beast appeared all too credible. Within a few years of the capture of Stumpp, Bedburg and the countryside around the town had been terrorized by a series of brutal murders and disappearances. Animals showed up mutilated, and human remains began to turn up, grotesquely disfigured. Panic set in among the townsfolk. They whispered of a monstrous wolf prowling the woods. That such an animal might be a man in disguise. Even worse, a werewolf took hold of the collective imagination. The man behind the legend. Peter Stumpp was a relatively prosperous farmer who lived on the outskirts of Bedburg. But of course, appearances can be deceiving. And despite the picture of a wealthy and respectable citizen, whispers followed Stumpp of darker secrets hidden beneath the veneer. A widower, he had 2 children from this marriage, a daughter, Beale, and a son. Given his behavior and unexplained wealth, some people suspected that Stumpp was involved in more than farming, but few could have foreseen the horrific allegations that were about to emerge. The Devil's Pact and the Werewolf Belt. Due to the legend built up around him, Peter Stumpp was believed to have made a compact with the devil, who in turn gave him a magical girdle. This girdle supposedly allowed Stumpp, when worn, to take on lupine form at will. In this form he was larger and more fearsome than any natural wolf, possessing a thirst for human flesh that was only satiated by acts of extreme violence. This notion of the pact with the devil was one that was commonplace in European folklore, reflecting well that strong feeling of fear that was elicited throughout this period of time in which diabolical influence was at its worst. The most powerful symbol of this pact, a physical manifestation of his deal with Satan, was a belt that he allegedly could change with. In most of the accounts that survive, Stumpp said the devil himself had promised him a potent exercise of his powers and protection in exchange for his soul, achieved via the use of the belt. This element of the story plays to deep-seated fears regarding the corruptive power of evil, as well as hidden dark sides perhaps lurking even beneath the most ordinary of individuals. That something as banal as an object might transform a man into a bloodthirsty beast was, at once, terrifying and yet believable to the populace of Bedburg, people who were already enshrouded in fear of the unknown. The atrocities, a campaign of terror. The crimes of Stumpp, based on historical accounts, were nothing less than monstrous. He was accused of killing at least 16 people. There are reports that mention even more. His victims included both men and women, children alike, whom he had attacked while in wolf form. The details of such murders are extremely gruesome. It is said that Stumpp tore his victims with his bare hands and teeth, devoured their flesh, and drank their blood. Of the many grotesque features of the alleged crimes of Stumpp, cannibalism bore prominence. That he had tasted the flesh of his victims is the charge brought against him, and for that act alone, most foul, it can be considered as only clear evidence of a pact with the devil. The bodies found were mutilated, limbs torn off, entrails ripped out, and throats bitten savagely. The most sensational of the claims against him included the killing and partial eating of his own son, an act of cannibalism viewed as absolute proof of his utter baseness. In doing so, the legend says that Stumpp lured his son deep into the woods and transformed into a wolf to attack him. After killing the boy, it's said that he had consumed his brain, an act that was both figurative and literal in its horror. Stumpp was further accused of incest with his daughter Beale, adding even more to the vileness of his crimes. Beale was executed with him later, though she had not been involved in the murder. This is a punishment against her supposedly for taking part in her father's crime, either by active participation or, worse still, through an incestuous relationship. The capture and trial, a spectacle of justice. The terror that finally gripped Bedburg was brought to an end in 1589 with the capture of Peter Stumpp. This arrest came at the end of an intense period of fear and speculation by both the townspeople and local authorities, desiring some effective way to stem the killings. According to some accounts, he was caught in the act of transformation. A party of hunters and villagers reportedly followed a large wolf said to transform back into Stumpp as they closed in. Under custody, Stumpp was subjected to torture, a very familiar device in those times to elicit confessions. He averred, while under torture, that he committed murders of the people, ate their flesh, and was in league with the devil. Indeed, he gave a very explicit account of how he, with the use of his magical belt, transformed himself into a wolf and managed such attacks. The said confession was considered proof beyond doubt of his guilt and pact with Satan. The trial of Stumpp attracted the public gaze, and multitudes came from Bedburg and neighboring towns to witness the proceedings against him. It was conducted at Cologne, meant not only for meting out justice, but also to act as a deterrent against witchcraft and making diabolical pacts. The records of the trial have survived to this date and allow a detailed insight into the charges brought against Stumpp and the testimony on the basis of which he was convicted. The sentence was as brutal as the crimes he had been accused of. On October 31st, 1589, Peter Stumpp was executed in a way that reflected the gravitas of his offences. He was placed on a breaking wheel, where his flesh was torn from his body by means of red-hot pincers. His limbs were shattered with the wheel to avoid any possibility of survival or resurrection, standard practice for the accused of witchcraft or diabolism. Finally, he was beheaded and his body was burned on a stake. His daughter Beale and his mistress, implicated in his crimes, also were executed. Beale was probably seen as tainted through her father's actions and an extension of the punishment given to Stumpp. Execution of his mistress was again expression of beliefs that those close to Stumpp were complicit in his evil deeds. Aftermath, a legacy of fear and superstition. Little did the execution of Peter Stumpp serve to assuage the terror that had struck at the very heart of Bedburg. Far and wide, his tale as a voracious wolf spread into the recesses of European folklore, serving as a cautionary tale about the perils of straying from the righteous path and about the awaiting judgment on one who made a pact with the devil. His story outlasted Stumpp for many years after his execution, serving as both a cautionary tale and a piece of dark entertainment. It became a metaphor of the dangers of the supernatural and the thin line between man and beast. The idea of the possibility of an ordinary man's turning into a monster under the influence of dark forces seemed to be one of the most catching and appropriated by a deeply religious and highly superstitious society. The case of Peter Stumpp added to the growing hysteria of werewolves and witchcraft across Europe. He was convicted and executed in line with a larger scale of witch hunts and trials across Europe, in which people were accused of consorting with Satan. The terror of werewolves would linger through more trials and executions throughout the succeeding decades after Stumpp's execution, werewolf or madman. The case of Peter Stumpp raises more questions than answers as to whether he actually was a werewolf or an insane criminal whose actions were explained in supernatural terms only. While the werewolf legend is deeply steeped in European folklore, it often acts as a means to explain and give reason to heinous acts that could not be otherwise rationalized. One argument that some historians have placed into the literature is that Stumpp was suffering from a severe mental illness such as clinical lycanthropy, a very rare psychiatric condition wherein a person actually believes he can change into an animal. In this case, a wolf. Clinical lycanthropy is such a delusion that is accepted by modern psychiatry, wherein the individual is convinced that he is transforming into a wolf or some other animal, and often acts violently about it. If, in this case, Stumpp really suffered from such a condition, he would have acted because of the disturbed mind, not because of any supernatural influence. Alternatively, Stumpp's crimes could have been an extreme product of sociopathy or psychopathy, finding their motivating factors in a lack of true empathy and remorse. It might be said that the more supernatural elements of the story, his supposed transformation into a wolf, the magical belt, and his pact with the devil, had been afterward added embellishments by society in an attempt to explain such extreme behavior in terms of witchcraft and demonic influence. Another critical factor is the confession wrung under torture. Indeed, in 16th century Europe, it was common to obtain confessions through torture, especially in witchcraft or heresy cases. Torture usually brought about extreme physical pain and psychological pressure, which contributed to false confessions. Thus, the victim would say anything for the torment to stop. It is further possible that Stumpp, under such duress, would confess to the crimes he had not committed or embellish his tales with elements of werewolf folklore to please the torturers. The symbolism and social function of the werewolf myth. The myth of the werewolf, as it came to be personified in the tale of Peter Stumpp, performed a plethora of social functions within the 16th century. It was one of the ways through which social expectations were upheld, in that it served as a caution against deviating from accepted and socially viable behaviors and moral codes. That an individual could, through the devil, become corrupted into this monstrous transformation reflected the intense religiosity of those times, wherein every sin and evil was seen as a threatening force. Furthermore, the myth of the werewolf had provided a source for communities to explain and control the fear of the unknown. In a period when mental illness, serial killers, and psychopathic behavior were not yet scientifically understood, such occurrences were explained by supernatural conceptions. The werewolf was both man and beast, a dual nature of humanness, the good and evil in each of us. This myth was also one of the ways to maintain social order. Relating the aberrant behavior with the forces of evil allowed the authorities to legitimize very harsh punishment and reinforce the existing social order. The torture and execution of Peter Stumpp in public did not serve the purpose of punishment for one criminal. Rather, it was a performance that had to be staged with the purpose of reassuring the powers of the church and the state and instilling fear into those who could become deviant from the norms. The historical impact, witch hunts, and werewolf trials. The trial and execution of Peter Stumpp were part of the larger tide of witch hunts and werewolf trials that swept through Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Very frequently, these were powered by a combination of religious frenzy, power politics, and social anxiety. Persecution of apparent werewolves, just as with witches, functioned in terms of scapegoating individuals for greater problems throughout society, whether this be plague, famine, and even civil breakdowns. Indeed, werewolf trials were more frequent in countries with a high level of folklore interest in the subject, including France, Germany, and Switzerland. These usually followed similar patterns to the witch trials, wherein torture was carried out in order to extract confessions. The combination of fear, superstition, and a wish for communal purification characterized these trials when communities wished to rid themselves of perceived spiritual and physical dangers. The case of Peter Stumpp was far from unique, but it was one of the most sensational. The sordid nature of his alleged crimes, allied with the supernatural elements of his story, fired the imaginations of contemporaries and helped to guarantee the immortality of his legend. The Stumpp case contributed to the ongoing hysteria surrounding werewolves and witches, helping to sustain the cycle of fear and persecution that defined the era. The development of the werewolf myth. The myth of the werewolf reflected changes throughout the centuries, produced by the influences of cultural and social contexts. During the medieval and early modern ages, werewolves often played the role of agents for the devil, and their transformations were a physical manifestation of their inner evil. That was in line with religious views then, which saw the world in stark terms of good against evil. As the sciences, particularly those dealing with the psyche and behavior of humans, advanced well into the 19th and 20th centuries, the myth of the werewolf started to be explained in more symbolic and psychological terms. The werewolf became a metaphor for the primeval animalistic instincts lying beneath the surface of human consciousness, a reflection of the struggle between civilization and barbarism, reason and madness. The figure of the werewolf also became a popular subject in literature and film, where it was often portrayed as a tragic figure, a person cursed to transform into a beast, struggling with his dual nature. This more nuanced portrayal reflected a growing understanding of the complexities of human psychology and recognition that the line separating sanity from insanity, humanity from monstrosity, is not always clear-cut. All the same, the essentials of the werewolf myth, transformation, violence, and the dissolution of boundaries between human and beast, remain constant. And it is these that continue to resonate with audiences, tapping into deep-seated fears and anxieties concerning the darker aspects of human nature. The legacy of Peter Stumpp, a cautionary tale. The story of Peter Stumpp, the Werewolf of Bedburg, remains a powerful cautionary fable that not only reflects in its time fear, superstition, and moral dilemmas, but also transcends its historical context to speak to more universal themes of evil, transformation, and human soul fragility. To those residing in Bedburg during the latter half of the 16th century, the crimes committed by Stumpp were real, and his execution was a just and essential act of justice, one that had to be done to purge such a monster from their midst. But to us today, the story remains that it might serve as a point of reference about the dangers of allowing fear and superstition to supplant reason and compassion. It points out in a like manner the ways in which society constructs boundaries between the human and the monstrous, the normal and the deviant. The legend of Peter Stumpp has also influenced the broader cultural understanding of werewolves, adding to the rich tapestry of werewolf lore that goes on to fascinate and terrify. A symbol of the very darkest aspects of human nature, whether regarded as an actual historical figure or even an entirely invented creature, Peter Stumpp remains one of the most intriguing figures in the annals of history. A man whose story continues to capture the imagination and provoke deep reflection on the nature of evil. Peter Stumpp in historical and cultural perspective. Any retelling of the story of Peter Stumpp has as part of its core the need to balance historical fact with the layering of myth that has taken place over the centuries. The actual facts around Stumpp's life and his crimes are lost in the mists of history, yet the effect of his story remains very real. It is a telling example of how fear, superstition, and social fears can meld together into a tale that lives on century after century. The story of Peter Stumpp concerns not the accusations against one man of heinous crimes, but rather the cultural and psychological forces that compel societies to build monsters out of the raw material of their deepest fears. Whether Stumpp was a literal werewolf, or simply a man whose actions were interpreted through the lens of superstition, his story offers much insight into the human condition and the ways in which we grapple with the mysteries of evil and transformation. Every time the legend of Peter Stumpp is told once more and gets wider elaboration, if not with due respect, we are again and again warned about the hair-thin borderline between historical fact and myth, reality and imagination. The Werewolf of Bedburg remains an omen, an eternal symbol in the struggle of light and darkness, reason and madness, humanity and the beast inside. Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your knowledge and wisdom in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.